Hello, and welcome to FACTS webinar, Solar Grazing in the Southeast, Opportunities and Challenges. Our guest presenter is Brock Phillips. I'm Samantha Gasson, FACTS Humane Farming Program Director, and I will be moderating this session. Thank you for joining us. Before we dive right in, let me take a minute or two to do a few quick introductions. Food Animal Concerns Trust, or FACT, is a national nonprofit organization that works to ensure that all food-producing animals are raised in a humane and healthy manner. We accomplish this by supporting humane farmers through our humane farming program, promoting policies that make foods from animals safe and healthy to eat through our Safe and Healthy Foods program, and generally help consumers make informed food choices. Please visit our website at foodanimalconcernstrust.org to learn more about all of our farmer services. And as always, I would like to thank my wonderful colleague, Catherine Hoke, who is joining us to help field questions and take over if my internet dies, which I don't think is likely to happen today because we don't have bad weather today. So I think we're going to be good. All right, at this time, I'm delighted to introduce our esteemed presenter, Brock Phillips. Originally from Kansas, Brock came to North Carolina in 2005 to attend the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Upon graduation in 2009, he began working with sheep and as the livestock manager on a diversified produce and livestock farm in Hillsborough, North Carolina, which is right down the road from Catherine and myself, raising grass-fed beef and lamb and pasture-raised pork and poultry. Brock started solo grazing in 2012 and since 2016 has focused on integrating sheep grazing into the vegetative management on utility scale solar farms. This includes management of a network of livestock producers across North Carolina to utilize their sheep flocks on utility scale solar farms, including best practices for grazing and advice on production, processing, and marketing from 2016 to 2017. And then he joined Carolina Solar Services in 2018 as the Director of Livestock Services. In this current role, he develops and implements solar grazing plans within CSS's, that's a lot of S's, portfolio of projects with a flock of 260 Katahdin breeding ewes across hundreds of acres of utility scale solar panels. He believes that solar grazing offers a new, unique opportunity for sheep producers, particularly in the eastern United States, and is dedicated to ensuring farmers take advantage of the opportunities within the renewable energy industry. He currently serves as the president of the North Carolina Sheep Producers Association and lives in Cedar Grove, North Carolina with his wife, their daughter, and their son. And for those of you who are familiar with Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, you are very, very familiar with Brock's wife, Mary Beth Miller, because she sends all the emails and organizes all of the conferences and is basically just amazing. We are super lucky to have another shepherd to talk to us today. We seem to be on a roll with shepherds this month. And he's going to talk about the opportunities for solo grazing in the Southeast. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Brock so that he may begin his presentation. Brock, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. Perfect. So yeah, first, I just want to thank you all for having me on here and taking the time out of the day to sit and listen to me chat about solar grazing in the Southeast and kind of my experience over the past decade or more, and kind of my thoughts on where things look moving forward. So I'll go through a couple of things, but really, you've had a bit of my background there and the work that I do with Carolina Solar Services. We'll take a quick look at the U.S. solar industry and then North Carolina specifically. One, because that's where I'm at, but two, I think it's helpful to look at a specific state to get an idea of the opportunity that exists. We'll then move on to kind of the interplay between solar farm management and a sheep operation, and then look at each of those operations individually, finally with a comparison between the two and how it might be able to be integrated into an existing sheep operation. So I am originally from Kansas, but I've been in North Carolina since 2005, and then graduated in 2009 from UNC Chapel Hill. And so not long after I started on the farm in Hillsborough, we had the opportunity to start solar grazing. And solar grazing back in those days was putting sheep out on a solar farm in the spring and then you came back and got the sheep in the fall. And there was someone else who had looked after them, but in my role, sheep were the seventh species on the list in terms of cattle, hogs, poultry, everything else. And so to have the opportunity to put the sheep somewhere and have them cared for was great. Um, it didn't always work out perfect, and I learned a lot, and then transitioned into a different role where I was specifically in the realm of solar grazing and coordinating with other farmers all across North Carolina to try to assist them in the management of farms in our network. And moving on from that, I am in my present role now with Carolina Solar Services and manage our own flock and integrate that in with our work of managing sites across the Piedmont. So for Carolina Solar Services, the parent company, it's a full scale, utility scale solar O&M provider. And so we do electrical work, landscaping, which is where the livestock come into play, as well as performance engineering, UAV, a little bit of everything. So we occupy, and I say we, me, the border collie and the sheep operate a small niche in that ecosystem, providing services for clients here in North Carolina for managing the vegetation. But CSS works here in the Southeast and also in a few states out west. The livestock division itself is what we call Carolina lamb. And so, as I'll discuss later on in this presentation, it's a lot of it is logistics, and ours is based upon the home farm here in Cedar Grove, North Carolina, and the distance of the solar farms and how we transport animals around. And so one way that we have built this region is to have a hybrid model between mowing and grazing. And so what that looks like is this past year, we managed approximately 370 acres within our specific portfolio in the central region. And that was 19 solar farms, of which we grazed and mowed 6 of them, and then 13 of them we just exclusively mowed. And that's based on a variety of factors that will come into play when we talk about the actual solar farm management and that side of the operation. For the staffing, we have 2 individuals, myself and another worker who mows almost full time, and then a part-time employee that helps me with the actual sheep work and making grazing plans and managing the sheep on farm. And then depending on how you classify workers, we've got another about 275 between a border collie, 270 breeding ewes, and 4 guardian donkeys. And I'll point out that I use the term breeding ewes, and for me as a solar grazer, that's the number that is most meaningful when talking about capacity and actually managing these farms, as that tends to be a more static number throughout the year and the type of animals that I will actually use to address vegetation on the solar farms. And so in speaking of the operation, it's sometimes a bit of a challenge talking to folks within the company, and come April, we'll have 450 animals, 500 animals when lambs are on the ground. And then there's a bit of fear later on when that goes back down to 270 because a lot of lambs have been sold. And so it's easier to talk in kind of that one static number that seems to be consistent and upon which we build the operation, which is the breeding ewes. So to look at the opportunity for solar grazing, I think it's helpful to look at the overall solar industry. And so this is information provided by the Solar Energy Industry Association and looks at, as of 2024, what were the top 10 states in terms of installed solar capacity. So effectively the size of solar farms in those states. And I may have played a little fast and loose with the term Southeast for effect, but if we're going to add Florida in and Virginia, 4 of the top 10 states are kind of the Southeast or here in the South. And so adding those numbers up, it's approximately, I wanted to say 40,000, or if I had added that up correctly, 40,000 megawatts, which at about 5 acres per megawatt is going on the order of 200,000 acres of solar farms that need to be managed in a region where grass and vegetation grows extremely well. And so that therein, I think, lies the opportunity. And the graph on the right shows how that growth has come about. And I'm going to say that that number is only going to rise, and other states here in the Southwest, as new markets kind of open up and essentially kind of the code is cracked in those and people can figure out permitting and how to build out that capacity, more opportunities will arise. And these are farms that are built and have an initial kind of lifespan of 20, 25 years. And here in the next few years, we'll see some of those here in North Carolina that are reaching the end of that lifespan, and kind of how are they reconfigured to continue along and last another 20 or 25 years. And so not only is it an existing opportunity, but I think it will persist for decades to come. And so I think it's worth examining as a small ruminant producer how it could be an opportunity that one could leverage their experience with sheep and their abilities to grow an operation. Looking more specifically at North Carolina, and I'll again state that North Carolina is where I operate, and also there's just a lot of good information, particularly from the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association. And so these numbers are from 2022, but I want to say the average utility scale project they had at about 33 acres, but really they run upwards of 3, 4, 500, 1,500 acres. And so as of 2022, there were about over 700 of these utility scale projects, and they covered over 38,000 acres. In the past, there's been this tension between agriculture and solar, which I don't fully understand, but that's easy for me to say, given that I sit in a very unique position of being in agriculture and solar. But the Sustainable Energy Association actually partnered with the NCDA back in 2017, and then they updated it in 2022 and issued a report showing kind of what impact did solar have on agricultural lands. And so of those 38,000 acres, approximately 31,000 are on agricultural lands, but that really only accounts for 0.28% of agricultural land in North Carolina. And so, in looking at it, solar is absolutely occupying land that was once in agriculture. And as you can see, the breakdown of some of these lands that were converted, 62% was actual cropland. Then you had 20% that was forest, be it evergreen or deciduous, and then 7% that was pasture and hay. And so agricultural land is coming out of use for solar farms. And so to be able to keep it in agricultural use by running sheep on it and having this dual use of the property, I think is a great opportunity. Also brings opportunity back to rural areas, which isn't always the case nowadays. But it also stands in direct contrast to the amount of agricultural land that's lost to residential development and other types of development. And so I want to say that it's in the report. It's on the order of maybe 1% of the agricultural land that was lost was due to solar farms, and that might be rounding it up. The majority of it was due to other types of development, from residential developments to golf courses, parks, things like that. And so it is something that is happening on a large scale, but also can continue to function as agricultural land. And so that's why I'm happy to share my experience with it in hopes of getting more folks out there to be able to manage it as agricultural land. So it's been interesting in the past to try to wrap my head around how a sheep operation and a solar farm vegetation maintenance operation actually coexist. And it's taken a while for me to identify these different areas, but I think it's critical in determining how you approach what that opportunity is. And so it's the cattle industry I think, has a few more steps within it in terms of cow calf to stocker to finishers to those different enterprises that can exist in a cattle operation. You have folks that exclusively do cow calf, or other folks that just feed lot animals and grow them out. I think it's useful to look at sheep grazing and solar grazing in the same way. And what is your focus? And so vegetation maintenance is a key one here in the Southeast on these farms. You then have what I'll call ewe lamb as a cow calf analog, and raising up breeding ewes to produce lambs. And then other potential opportunities are growing and finishing out those lambs, or growing out replacement ewes for your flock or for sale. And I, I like to tell my kids you can do anything, but you can't do everything. And I've slowly learned this over the past 10 years, is trying to do everything with sheep as an individual or a single farm is a challenge. And so going into it with a prioritization of what you are going to focus on and be successful at is going to long term set you up for success. And so all of these have different opportunities with them, but they've got different challenges, and will take your time away and focus away. So just at the outset, you can look at the acreage side of it and the amount of home acreage that you have, and the cost of land or leasing land for raising animals on your own, growing out animals on your own, and running your existing or planned on sheep operation. And then you can look more broadly at the amount of managed acreage. And I think a lot of people see that opportunity, and it's great. I mean, if we're talking about 38,000 acres in North Carolina alone and hundreds of thousands of acres across the Southeast, there is an opportunity. It becomes a challenge, though, because with that managed acreage comes different expectations and different amounts of resources that are required of you. And so this also ties in then to the revenue and how much you're able to make on your existing operation and the expenses associated with it, versus taking on solar farm management and potentially new equipment, more animals, a reduction in feed because you have animals going out to eat grass, and yet more labor costs to take care of those solar farms. Another aspect of that too, though, is diversification. And so we've had it happen to us, even as a company with hundreds of different sites all across the Southeast, that a contract is a contract until something changes. And so if a site gets sold or people decide to change service providers, we in 2020, I thought that with the pandemic, solar grazing was like the most insulated business to be in. And I was only around sheep, and they hadn't quite established a pathway for COVID to get from sheep to people. And I was far out in rural areas, out in the open. It was great. And yet, knock on effects of something, we had a client who had the opportunity to sell sites, and we lost 300 acres on which we grazed sheep. And so we had to change and pivot and sell sheep and have home acreage to bring them back to. And so I think it's this idea of diversification where maybe you don't want to focus on growing out and finishing lambs, but is there a way to maximize the revenue, or rather optimize the revenue from these different segments, such that the business is resilient, whether you lose a vegetation contract, or if you sell animals at auction, if lamb prices go down, different things like that. Your resources will also dictate what you choose to focus on. And if you have a lot of home acreage, maybe you don't have as much need or desire to go out and find more acreage to grow an operation. If you have, say, maybe a family member, a son or daughter coming back home, it could be an opportunity to expand the farm and support more families by adding on an enterprise of doing solar farm management. And so that'll play into it. The equipment that you have, and also just your technical experience of raising sheep. It's not a whole lot different raising sheep on a solar farm as it is on a home farm in terms of animal health and welfare and good animal husbandry. And so for folks who have been raising sheep for years, it's a good opportunity to leverage that experience and those early hard times, gaining that experience to then be able to put it to use to possibly earn more revenue and add on a new enterprise. On the livestock side, there's a perspective of, do you have high input or low input animals? And do you have those animals that you're expecting triplets or quads out of, and they get supplemented quite a bit, and they need more shelter, they need more care? those will tend to struggle a little bit more on solar farms where it's much more of a forage based system. And the animals, I mean, to be frank, we push our animals hard because their primary goal is to graze solar farms. And we don't do it to their detriment, but it is very much a forage based diet. And they graze on these solar farms where the forage is highly variable. And that's why we do focus on dry ewes, because it's that point where they're not lactating, they're not gestating, they have very low maintenance requirements, and they can get by on that more, I guess, marginal forage, if one will call it that. And you get some sites that are few and far between where you can make animals fat, but you kind of play to that lowest common denominator, and it's the dry ewe that can actually thrive in these situations. And then finally, there's just your personal preferences and strengths. If you like direct selling meat at a farmer's market, putting animals out on a solar farm to then bring back and adding all that in takes away from that. And so it's recognizing what you're good at, but also what you like, such that you're going to give the time and energy to it and be successful. This is a chart I got it inspiration from this, I want to say, I don't know, 7-8 years ago from the Stockman grass farmer, and adapted it a little bit before for myself, but to stack just across the span of a year, what are we looking at for a variety of different factors? And so the columns, of course, are the different months, and then the rows occupy different aspects that I've added in the solar farm management, but tie into an actual sheep operation. And so tracking, when do you have your perennial forage base, both cool season and warm season? When do you as a farm plant annuals, if you do, and when would those be available? Where, for me, a spring lambing comes into play, and the different periods for that, from breeding in the fall to when lambing occurs and then weaning, specifically when I need to have the ewes ready to go back out to a solar farm. Going down to marketing and the different classes of animals and when you'd have time to be able to market them, or rather the time to be able to market them. Specifically to, I think, small ruminants is the non-traditional or ethnic holidays that can drive a lot of those prices, as well as more Western holidays like Easter and Christmas. Where do those fall? How does that sync up with your breeding season, your lambing season? And the Muslim holidays are based on a lunar calendar, and if I'm not mistaken, move up every 12, 14 days a year. And so that comes into play in terms of when you can time marketing and marketing different sizes of animals. And then you get down to the solar farm management, which is when are you supposed to be outside making grass shorter, as we like to say. When do herbicide applications have to happen on farms, if that's one way of trying to streamline the management, coupled with all the other work that goes into it. And so for me, it's helpful visually to have all of this broken down and see where that overlap is or where things need to be added. And to give a specific example, if I'm going to be lambing in February and March, that means that I'm probably going to need, I'd like to do that outside. I'd like to have some sort of stockpiled forage through the winter as long as I can, and then have annuals ready March and April. And so when am I going to plant that? When am I going to have it ready? And when are those animals that are born in February and March going to be of a certain age and size such that they'll hit different markets? And so it's, I won't say completely clear in looking at it, but piecing these different things together can really help in terms of, if you can eliminate that row of solar farm management, maybe that makes life easier, and maybe just a standard sheep operation and the kind of chess pieces of that are enough to keep you busy and successful. But how does that solar farm aspect of it add in? So as I mentioned before, we went on and on about how to call sheep managing solar farms, like internally at our company, whether it was grazing or mowing, and then we just came down to saying it's we're making grass shorter. And how do we accomplish that? That's the trick. And so For us in North Carolina, where we operate, it's understanding the seasonal growth of forages. And down here, as with most places, we've got the spring flush that comes on, and usually it's early April. Some sites farther east will have to be out there in March. And that's the time where we're coming out of lambing, and I'm not yet weaning them. And so we'll mow sites earlier in the year. But understanding the sheep and the ewes are most productive and generating the most revenue when they're out eating grass on a solar farm, the dry ewes. And so that's why we've bumped up our lambing, not super early, but to breed in late September and October, such that we can have ewes out on solar farms in mid-May. We can hit everything with a mow early on in the season and then have those ewes start rotating through. The other challenge that we run into, particularly on these solar farms, is different weeds, which honestly, if everything was fescue or crabgrass, it'd be a dream because they grow, they head out, and they're a certain height, you can manage that. It's the pokeberry that gets 8 feet tall, somehow above the back edge of the panel or growing through. Those are the weeds that are the challenge. And I think as anyone who's raised animals and converted cropland or seen what happens to land when pine trees are taken off of it and the soil's not amended, it's just nature trying to fill that vacuum, and a lot of these weeds come on. So we've tried to shift away from herbicide applications or minimizing that, and the sheep actually do a really good job of hitting weeds when they're younger. However, it still has to be managed, and it doesn't matter how good a job a sheep does. If something's blocking the panels, like these weeds, it has to be managed. So understanding the site that you're working on, what's going to grow, and how you're going to take care of it. We have, over time, determined a stocking rate that we use on these farms is on the order of about 1.5 to 2 sheep per acre. And that's contrasted with the stocking density. And so to put that in perspective, these are dry ewes that we're using, and I will move a group of about 180 to 200 ewes, and they'll go on a 15-acre farm. I subdivide that with electric fencing, and they will graze for anywhere from 3 to 5 days on 4 to 5 acres and then move along. And so those sheep are grazing across a portfolio of, say, 90 acres over the course of a year, moving all around. Well, on any given day, they're at a stocking density of, say it's 200 sheep on 5 acres, of 40 sheep per acre. And so that's where you can get a lot more intensive grazing, a more even graze that is mimicking a mow and taking care of all the vegetation. Also gives you the opportunity to rotate them around and be able to, one, make sure they don't have any health issues, but also get the best nutrition and slowly improve the forage on these sites. And so that's one aspect of it. And then how we integrate it with the mechanical, biological, and chemical strategies is kind of that, I'd say secret sauce, but there's nothing secret about it. It's making grass shorter, and it's very idiosyncratic to the sites on which you graze, and whether it was a former pasture and hayfield, and there's not a ton of weeds or saplings or things like that, or if it was cropland that is just eager to put all the weed seeds up since it's not getting tilled and turned over. For the solar farm management, you're looking at things in the off season as you try to get ready for the year. And so there's the aspect of selling yourself to a company and getting a contract and finding those sites that are nearby, but understanding that it's very different than a home farm and there's different expectations. And while I'm sure none of the companies would say they're against soil health, the idea of letting vegetation grow tall to have a deeper root system and then hitting it every couple of months so that you're within the parasite, I guess you're outside of that window of the parasite cycle threatening the sheep, is kind of second to, is the grass shading the panels and is the site producing power? And so you have to understand how to manage those sites to keep the grass down such that panels aren't shaded, and that the site is still accessible by everyone who needs to get there, manage it, fix things that go wrong with the electrical equipment. So as you do this, you may see sites that you're driving around in your county and then that are nearby, And you've got to look at zoning, kind of your equipment, how are you going to get animals there? And if you're going to have to mow it, what equipment you have for that. And so it's items like that that can be a challenge. And then actually communicating and reporting to the company that owns it, because so many of these companies, that it's an asset that sits there and it should function. There's not a lot of moving parts, and yet they like to know that the asset's being managed. So how are you going to report to them that the sheep are grazing it, that the grass is low, that the site is being managed to their, I guess, to their standards? And so one benefit I've found of sheep grazing is this tension that exists sometimes in rural communities with solar farms can be broken simply by the introduction of sheep. And I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, but there's a lot of folks that are upset seeing agricultural land being converted to a solar farm, and yet you put sheep and a donkey out there, and it definitely changes people's opinions when they're seeing the land used as, say, their grandfather ran livestock on it, and it's actually being kind of productive agriculturally, just in a very different way. And so that's one realm in which I do think there's this symbiosis between solar grazing and solar development that can not cure all ills, but definitely help to pave the way towards better relations with the communities in which they're being built. And so this kind of goes back to it's an older setup that I had, and I've since shifted to a single strand of electric fencing on the leading edge of these solar panels. But being able to have this interior fencing and understanding ahead of time where you're going to set this up, which I'll talk about, I believe, on the next slide in terms of making that site plan, but how are you going to fence it off such that you can get an intensive graze and then move the animals, keep them in a specific area. And how we do it is to have animals on a site and then off within a week or two, such that if anyone needs to come out and take care of the site, 90% of the time, they never have to interact with an animal. And therefore there's no issue for their normal operation. The challenge, though, is on these sites, they're built with like a 6-foot chain link fence and barbed wire on top, which seems incredibly secure until you realize that that's for keeping humans out, and it's the other predators and neighborhood dogs, which has been our worst experience, that can cause issues with the sheep. So as you're preparing the site, checking that perimeter fence, we've found that even just rocks and gaps underneath the fence goes a long way, because if you're rotating the animals enough, any predator is going to try, and if they can't get in, they'll try again, and you give them enough time, they'll find a way in. Well, if you keep the sheep moving fast, the predators, by the time they figure it out, there's no more animals there, they move along. And so definitely make sure that the perimeter fence is secure to keep your animals safe. And what we'll also do is figure out ways to take water and mineral out to the sites and locate them in various spots on the site such that animal impact is spread out in the paddocks in which the animals graze, essentially trying to incentivize the animals to go specific ways and graze across the entirety of the site, as opposed to sticking everything right there by the gate and it's 95 degrees in the middle of the summer in North Carolina and they want to hang out under the panels, drink water, eat mineral, and go right back. So if you can incentivize to keep them moving, then that can also help to get a better product in terms of management of the farm. And this is the slide that, with Google Earth and the ability to create these paddocks and measure paddocks, this is a site that we manage just north of Durham, and I'd love to subdivide it more, and some sites lend themselves to it, but this one, I'm not a solar farm designer, so I don't really understand why it was designed the way that it was, but this is the way that we've tried to work with natural contours and natural lines and create these paddocks so there's an even amount of acreage and actually being able to get an even graze across these different paddocks. Here, 1 second. Sorry, the other employee, the border collie, was not too happy being outside and not working with sheep today, so he had to be let back in. But creating the site plan is probably no different than you do on your own farm. in terms of making those decisions ahead of time for how animals are going to be moved through these areas and how they're going to create that best product for managing vegetation, staying healthy, and essentially keeping the client happy. So as I mentioned, we deal with a lot of smaller sites, and I say smaller, they're anywhere from 15 to 30 acres. And so we haul animals a lot. If there's an opportunity for a bigger site, that can change things, but that will dictate how you manage the animals. And so I do it with the border collie I just had to let in and a 26-foot double decker trailer. And honestly, the best investment we've ever made. And so the sheep will be loaded up. We usually try to do it in 2 trips in a day. The donkey goes in the back and we'll haul down the road. And so in terms of farm investment, it was an expensive investment, but again, we couldn't function without it. And so for us, we go through a lot of small sites. This trailer is key. I think if you had a big site, you could probably get away with hiring someone to haul your sheep there in the spring and then haul them off in the fall if that was the case. And so it's just determining where that opportunity lies and what you're going to need. The other big problem is water. And for us, we don't have a site that has water on it. And more solar developers are hearing that water is useful, not just for sheep, but for so many other aspects of solar management. But we still have to haul water. And so I do joke that I probably dump out more water than the sheep actually drink because these solar sites are 40, 50% shaded with the panels. And there's a microclimate that keeps the sheep cooler. The grass, I think, has a higher moisture content underneath the panels in the areas where it's shaded. So they don't drink a lot. But we do haul it in a 320-gallon tank on the back of a truck where I can haul this trailer as well. So hauling water can get time consuming and expensive. And so a well on site is a huge advantage as you're figuring out what the sheep are going to be able to do in terms of solar farm management. And then finally, I won't say a throwaway line, but it can be critical. Are you going to, if the sheep can't manage everything, are you going to mow, or is it going to be subcontracted out to someone who does it professionally and can do it quick and allow you to focus on your sheep enterprise? So for us, this is kind of the sample plan as we look at the grazing season. And so a lot of it is based upon, here in the Southeast, the barber pole worm and its life cycle. I push the envelope a bit in terms of trying to get the dry ewes to a site. And honestly, if I could let it go 60 to 75 days, I would. But it's usually going to be right around like 40 days to rotate animals back. And so in selecting animals and the type of animals that you have, it's something to keep in mind for how hard you're going to push them and how susceptible they are to parasites. But for our year, we're starting in February and March with lambing. And sometimes we try to expose ewe lambs at 7 to 8 months old, and any of those that are open or other open ewes will decide whether or not we want to cull them later in the season and mark them, but they'll go out to start grazing the solar farms earlier to open up more pasture at home for those ewes that did produce lambs. And then there in April and May, we'll do that first mow or the first graze. Come May and early June, we've weaned the lambs and the dry ewes are going out to the solar farms. And that just starts the cycle of every 6 weeks, 5 to 6 weeks, we're trying to have a mow or a graze on the site to be able to manage to client expectations on those sites. And I will readily admit that this is an ideal scenario and you've got to have a plan just so you kind of have something you don't hit sometimes. But in an ideal world, we would do one of our final mows in August and September so we could stockpile grass. And a huge benefit I've found is if I can keep those dry ewes out on solar farms until January, then I can rest pastures at home a whole lot longer. I can dedicate better pastures to lambs, and I can also bale graze out there and move cut the feed bill if there's stockpiled grass, but I can roll out hay on the top, under the top side of panels, and therefore spread out that hay and protect it from the elements, but keep those animals moving. And so it works for me as a sheep producer. And so all that's been on solar farm management, and now it's kind of talking more about your actual sheep farm operation. And for better or worse, I came to sheep as essentially a novice. I had not grown up with animals or anything else. Everything I learned was just kind of um, as I was exposed to new things, both as the livestock manager and raising sheep ourselves. And so understanding the different classes of sheep and what they need is, I think, critical. One, for a good sheep operation, but particularly for solar farm management. And so between your dry ewes, breeding rams, growing and finishing lambs, and then replacement ewes, it's been a juggling act for us to figure out what works best. And what I've settled on is I don't like to lamb on solar farms. I like to lamb on the home farm because I can keep an eye on the animals, intervene when I need to, and have a lot of touch essentially that one time of year when you can set up the rest of the season. Growing and finishing lambs will then never see a solar farm because I do not have a farm in my portfolio that has one, good enough grass that will maintain that plane of nutrition, and two, it's really hard to see a downed lamb on a solar farm. And if you don't catch it early, then you have a dead lamb. And having a dead lamb on a site you're supposed to be maintaining is not the most professional way to run the business. And I'm not saying that it doesn't happen, but it's when you don't find that and it attracts buzzards and neighbors complain that it can be an issue. And so for me, our decision has been to run dry ewes with more established immune systems, lower nutritional requirements. They know how to respond to a border collie. They don't just stare it down and drive you crazy trying to get them herded up. But the balance of that is our replacement ewes. And as I'm selecting ewe lambs, I need those ewe lambs to function in that same environment that the mature ewes are. And so how can I raise them out on pasture and maybe when they're 6 or 7 months, take them out to a solar farm and operate that way? So those different classes will dictate where you put your time and resources. And so for us, you look at that revenue distribution and we generate probably 75% of our revenue from solar farm grazing. And so my focus is on the dry ewes and moving them around on solar farms. I do not have the skill yet to grow really good grass to grass finish lambs for direct to consumer sales. I'd love to, but I'm not good at that, and I realize that. And so what I've taken to doing is trying to sell as many lambs as soon as possible, and particularly the ram lambs. Some folks who need the mouths will castrate the ram lambs such that when they're older they can be run on solar farms to graze. But for us, it's focusing on the solar farm management, growing and finishing lambs as another revenue stream, and then kind of having that blend with the replacements so that they can function that next year on a solar farm. For predator protection, it's another key point. A lot of folks use guardian dogs, and you can on solar farms, but then you have to go there every day and feed them. So we use guardian donkeys, which are more hands-off and probably not as strong of protection as the guard dogs, but they work for us and work for our, I guess, our process for managing the sites. So one thing to look at as you expand to a solar farm and the opportunities there is, one, you can separate classes. And so if you have a smaller acreage and you've got to wean ram lambs, maybe you don't actually have to castrate them because you can separate out animals more and you've got your dry ewes going farther away. You have a higher carrying capacity because you've opened up home acreage for the lambs and the ewes are going out to other acreage to eat grass that you're getting paid to manage. And additionally, you can actually have improved parasite management by resting more land at home. And that's why I really like bale grazing the dry ewes in the winter, because I can then take land here at home and essentially not touch it for 4 months, 5 months, so that when I bring the ewes back and we plant spring annuals, we can actually have as clean, I think, as possible while maintaining productivity of a pasture for the sheep to come back to. And I think I've just got one or two more slides here, and then we can do some questions. But for us, I think one thing that shifts on that home operation is breeding and where you're going to do it. If you're used to flushing and your sheep are on a solar farm, then you're driving out to that solar farm to try to flush them, and that can complicate it. However, we've had really good success breeding earlier on solar farms because you have more shade across the entire site, and therefore the rams seem to maintain their virility into the heat of summer quite a bit. We haven't been able to incorporate fall lambing, which is great for accessing different markets. It's hard to incorporate with solar farm management. And then we try to do accelerated lambing or accelerated weaning rather, where we take the lambs off and then we'll feed them in this hoop structure you see in the back to support their nutrition and grow them out. But a lot of what this comes down to as well is just selection criteria. And on a standard sheep operation, if you're breeding for prolificacy, that can be a challenge in a solar operation where you don't quite have that nutrition. Parasite resistance has been key for us in how we've purchased breeding rams in the past, but even more so, docility is, and that may not be the right word, but we get rid of crazy sheep as soon as possible, because if they don't respond to a border collie, all it takes is one of them to take the other 199 somewhere else and make a long day even longer. So
Before we
the,
move on, could you explain what flushing is?
Sure. Yeah, flushing is the idea of essentially mimicking an increase in nutritional status for the ewes, such that they will, my don't have much vet schooling, they will ovulate more and drop more eggs that can be fertilized. And so a lot of folks will do it with just like whole corn or just some higher plane of nutrition, such that the ewe's body is kind of tricked into, oh, I have better nutrition. I can carry more animals and therefore increase the potential for a higher lambing crop.
Thank you.
And so on this last part is kind of generic, but comparing the various operations and trying to put them in context of one another, and just there's a dichotomy to it of having so much more autonomy on a home sheep operation where baling twine is a sufficient fix sometimes, not so much for solar farm management. And so you're more accountable to someone who's paying you to do work, and therefore you have to operate in a different mindset. Your home operation does have more limited acreage, but the increased acreage on solar farm comes with additional costs and other challenges. One of those challenges is just how good of nutrition you're going to get on those sites, and therefore what animals would do the best on it. As I mentioned, it doesn't take much for things to change hands in the solar industry, and it doesn't happen a lot, but it can. And so those long-term investments you make on your home farm are more limited for solar farms unless you have the right relationship with an owner or developer who really believes in it. And so it forces you to be a little more nimble and have more temporary infrastructure. I think particular to FACT, one thing that I've found challenging is actually implementing certain like third-party certification protocols, whether it's animal welfare approved or things like that, when you're beyond your home sheep operation. And leased acreage down the road is one thing, but a solar farm that's an hour away is really hard to do daily checks on, and is really hard to make sure you're meeting those other criteria that are set forth in those protocols. And so for an operation that is built around those certifications, I'm not saying it's insurmountable, but it definitely has to be re-examined in the context of where that solar farm is located and how you manage them. Because for us, the sheep are resilient. We've set stuff up that I will check them every 3 days and shift them when I check them, and in the sake of being efficient and managing a variety of sites. And that doesn't fit with a lot of protocols. So with that, I just want to leave you all with some of these resources that are super helpful. The American Solar Grazing Association has done a phenomenal job bringing together grazers, developers, owners, operations, and maintenance folks within the solar industry to try to increase access to farms and promote solar grazing and the benefits that it has. Here in North Carolina, the small ruminant unit does a really good job of tying in both I guess, animal husbandry and production and looking into the solar aspect of farm operations down here. Um, Eastern Alliance for Production Katahdins provides quite a bit of good information in terms of expected breeding values and farm operations and how to actually select animals and using data to drive an operation. So I've learned quite a bit from there. And then more broad industries are the American sheep industry and the North Carolina Sustainable Energy Association for solar specific activities. And so just as a final plug for the American Solar Grazing Association, they actually, as a member, you can search the map on there where people will post different sites where they're looking for grazers, and you can in fact put your operation on the map such that if someone is looking to place a site somewhere, they can find you and reach out and contact you for opportunities.
Thank you so much, Brock. That was really great. And while you're sort of taking a break, maybe getting some water, I'm going to go ahead and launch our poll. If you wouldn't mind answering this is actually really helpful for us. And I know that I say this every webinar, at the end of every webinar, it helps get us funded and that type of thing, so we can keep everything free for you guys. And Catherine, you want to go ahead and ask Brock the first question? And everybody, just make sure you go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A. And yeah, if you have a comment that you want everybody to hear, feel free to put that in the Q&A too. Doesn't have to be a question.
Our first question. Oh, go ahead, Sam.
I was hoping this is actually with a chat and a question in the chat too. So when you say, I know you raise Katahdins, right? You have Katahdins on there. What do you do when they're shedding? Because it sounds like you've got them out on those solar panels right when they're shedding. And if they're anything like my Katahdins, I have St. Croix. If they're anything like my St. Croix, they are rubbing on absolutely everything, and then that wool does not, or fur, I guess, I don't know what you want to call it, does not, or hair, I guess, does not go anywhere, and it just stays in clumps. And usually my border collies find it, bring it up to the house, and I think I have a dead lamb somewhere.
Yeah, I tend not to worry about it. From one perspective, I've tried to select those animals that carry longer coats into the summer, selected against them unless they've really excelled in other areas. The biggest concern it provides me is they don't really damage panels rubbing up against it or the chain link. It's mainly just your heart skipping a beat when you see a big clump of wool from like 50 yards away. And so the one thing I have learned is to at least pick that up so it only makes my heart skip a beat once, as opposed to every time, which I have been foolish enough to do that for years and have since just made a blanket policy of cleaning that up, so I don't have to stress about it. But it doesn't really damage anything on the solar farms, and they really like the chain link, which keeps them away from the equipment when they're doing that shedding and rubbing.
Okay. Yeah, that was, somebody had asked about that in the chat. Okay. Catherine, you want to start us off?
Yeah, the first question is specific to the solar panels themselves. Let me get back here. Yeah, what is the lifespan of the panels and what happens to them when they need to be replaced?
Yeah, so I believe that the panels are meant to last the life of the project. And so a lot of those agreements run 15 to 20 to 25 years. And these sites are being constantly monitored to determine what sort of efficiency they're getting out of those panels, because there is kind of a decline in production over the course of time. And so as it stands now, we're just seeing some of those sites that were built in like the late aughts that are kind of getting converted. And the beauty of these solar farms is, with the racking and everything else that's in there, taking out the screws and replacing the panels with new, more efficient panels is very much a possibility. There does need to be an industry that's kind of growing for recycling panels that doesn't quite exist yet, and I think is going to come to a head in the next 5 to 10 years as some of these earlier sites reach the end, or rather they've had enough drop in production that they need new panels. And then I don't know where that's at right now. I know there's a few recyclers, but it's going to be a problem here in the future.
All right, thank you. Rich asks, we have 5 to 7 acres of unused pasture on a south-facing slope. Is it feasible to put this into use for a utility scale solar and grazing sheep? I guess
So-
what is the size of a utility scale solar
Yeah, yeah. So
farm?
a utility scale solar is usually larger than 1 megawatt, and that would be probably 3 to 5 acres. So a lot of these sites are sited depending upon where the electric grid is and substations and demand, and so there's a lot of specifics that go into that. I would say it could be a better opportunity for if there's energy needs on farm to put up a solar array in that section that's a little bit smaller to take care of your farm needs. Can be fewer hoops to jump through in terms of not having to deal with the developer or other folks. But yeah, that would be on the small side probably for being able to do a utility scale project.
Do you recommend a certain breed of sheep for this kind of grazing?
I recommend the hair sheep, but that's also because I don't have a ton of it. I guess a ton of experience with wool sheep. I think the challenge is you can't control the environment as much, and so to be able to get a good fleece off wool sheep, I think might be a challenge with different weeds and other things on solar farms if you're using them that way. I also think the heat here in the southeast is a challenge and more stressful for moving animals around a lot. Potentially, the panels could provide for a cooler environment, and so maybe wool sheep would actually do better than in a standard setting. But I find the parasite resistance and kind of the good maternal traits of hair sheep go a long way towards building a sheep operation that can manage solar farms as well.
Yeah, then you also have to either learn how to share them or find somebody who will share them, which is uh, hard.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Spirity. She's wondering if there's a Facebook group where farmers, I'm not sure if she want if they're if for farms are looking for someone to graze them or they want to sell their solar farm. I'm not quite sure what the question is, but I guess either one. Do you know if there's a Facebook group, or I know you listed if you join that group, then you can find out there. But do you
Yeah,
know of any other places where you can sort of get involved?
I don't, and I think that's been one of the challenges is specifically on Facebook. If you've got a farmer group, it's a bunch of farmers, and they may not have the connection into other aspects of the industry. The American Solar Grazing Association has done a really great job of not just creating a forum for farmers to complain to farmers. It's mostly solar grazers, but there's a lot of different folks within the industry who are looking to have sites managed, building sites, and so by having all those different stakeholders, I think it actually makes for a meaningful map and area in which to interact with folks to find those opportunities, be it where to graze or if you're looking for someone to graze a site, being able to find those producers that are interested in that opportunity.
So I remember in North Carolina there used to be sun raised because we actually went to a meeting about them and decided it was not going to work for us, but mainly because they won't have anything close to us. But they were recruiting farmers who would maintain their own flock on farms that they held the contract on. Do you know of any other organizations? Do they even exist anymore? I don't even know.
So I don't know if Sunrays still exists. That's actually who I had worked for back in 2016 and 17, working with different farmers, and that was always the challenge, was trying to find a contract close to a farmer who was looking for that opportunity and matching that up. So your experience was actually sadly more the norm of my experience of like folks who were really interested but just not having that opportunity nearby. So I don't believe that Sunraised is still managing like or growing a larger network. They've got a lot of farms they manage themselves, but there are different individuals through the American Solar Grazing Association. Like I've spoken to a few folks who actually to call it a franchise, I think is gives the wrong vibe, but people who are maybe looking to manage a site but don't have all of the equipment to do it full scale can work with a larger organization or company that maybe has the contract or wants someone solar grazing on it but doesn't have the sheet. And so again, coming back to the American Solar Grazing Association, think you can make connections there to potentially find opportunities to work with other folks.
Thank you.
Could you explain how you deal with aggressive weeds with animals there? in the field?
Yeah, so it's usually it falls more to mechanical management, and there comes some point where the sheep aren't gonna take care of it. But I've found that if we can get animals to those weeds early on, they actually do really well. So the sheep really like dog fennel. They'll like mare's tail, some of those. Um, Pokeweed is toxic to sheep, but I think it's in that same vein of if you provided an entire field of pokeweed and they actually decided to eat all the pokeweed, it would probably hurt them. I have yet to teach sheep to graze pokeweed, which I think in small quantities would not be lethal. It would be ideal for managing it, but usually it's you combine it with some sort of mechanical management and to kind of set everything back and then bring those sheep in to just um, be able to manage those weeds and try to get something else established. We broadcast seed underneath the panels and then really tightened up the rotation for the sheep such that those weeds are going to keep coming back if there's nothing else to take its place. And so broadcasting seed under there has sometimes helped, but it's just a challenge for these sites where they're trying to put up panels, not grass. And so it's not always amended in a way to lead to the best forage possible.
So I thought if the pokeweeds are super young, then they can be eaten. It's just as they get older. Is that? 'Cause I had a friend. This is a This is like a country friend, and she loved picking those pokeweed leaves because they're poisonous to people too once they get to a certain point. But when they're young, apparently you can eat them and they're delicious. I wasn't willing to do that because I think it sounds a little too dangerous for me. But she
Yeah.
swore by it, and she was a Montessori school teacher, and she taught my youngest kids. So
Yeah, it
I don't
tastes like asparagus. You really have to prepare it well. You really have to boil it, cook it for a long time, but it is technically edible.
but she said it had to be the young leaves, just as soon as they as soon
The
as they
shoots, yeah.
but yeah.
And that would be the time. I usually see it, and maybe my eyes just drawn to it once it's like 4 foot tall. And so
Yeah.
I'm missing those tiny stalks that have actually been grazed by the sheep because I'm just in awe of a 8 foot stalk with, and the worst part about it is you get birds eating it and then they perch on the back of the top of the solar panels. And so for years I
Yeah.
wondered
Oh,
why
no.
pokeweed grew exclusively on like directly under the leading edge of the top. And then I just watched birds one time and they're just specifically planting it directly behind that. So it's one of the more challenging weeds to try to manage on the solar farms.
While we're on the topic of how you're managing weeds and grass when the sheep aren't completely handling it, what kind of mower are you using in this situation?
Yeah, so we usually operate with like a bush hog on the back of a tractor that will go a little bit under the bottom edge of the panel. And
Mhm.
then we've since shifted to a tracked zero turn, which can manage the rest of the vegetation. Um, but I really think a sickle bar mower, if it's working well, can go a long way towards at least once or twice a year being able to cut under the panels, such that you could eliminate a lot of the herbicide application early on in the season for most sites, and actually be able to manage it with like a 5 or 6 foot sickle bar hanging off the side of the tractor. But yeah, our tractor's a 55 horse Kubota with an 8 foot bush hog on the back, and then a zero turn.
So Christy has a couple of questions, and she said that she's having difficulty getting callbacks to get her sheep on solar farms. But it sounds like if she just joins the American Solar Association, Solar Farm Association, then she would be in good shape. I don't know if she's part of that organization or not.
It'll
Would
help.
that be your advice?
It'll increase your chances, but yeah, more often than not, it's very challenging to get up with owners of solar farms, and they've got a number on there, but a lot of times it doesn't seem to go anywhere or get folks to call back. And so twofold with the American Solar Grazing Association, they're trying to promote solar grazing more so that it's on the radar of more asset owners and people who own these sites, such that maybe it'll actually make a light go off in their head when someone calls to put sheep on it. But two, it's been helpful to talk to different grazers, and sometimes it's just talking to a grazer in, say, New Jersey, who's worked with this specific company, and that company just hasn't even looked into it down here. And so you can make those connections and just kind of toss it out to the member group of, has anyone worked with company X or have contacts there? And that can usually put you in the right direction. But it's It's not a silver bullet. It'll just increase your chances.
Okay. Catherine, you want to take the next question? And then we're just going to ask 2 more questions and that's it because we're coming to the end. And I did, Linda had a question about natural tails and how do you keep up with health with natural tails? But I think if you do hair sheep, you don't really have to worry about natural tails because they just don't have the same issues that wool sheep do.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I stopped docking tails years ago for the Katahdins. Because I also figured that taking them to auction, that was at least an extra 25-50 cents if they're going by weight. So it was extra work and I was losing money on it. So figured I'd just leave it be.
So what hazards exist and how can we mitigate for them? I've heard about a sheep that got caught in the moving parts of the panels between cab lines. What other bizarre things do sheep do out there?
If a sheep can kill itself, it will. That's for sure.
Yeah, and honestly, I've only lost 1 sheep to its own terminal decision making in the past 10-12 years. And that was a sheep who somehow got freaked out and tried to run away from me and had kind of like cut itself on its back trying to go under panels where it was sharp. But there are tracking sites that usually move slow enough such that just like if you're bush hogging a pasture that sheep are in, so long as you're not going too fast, the animals will shift and it shouldn't be an issue. But given usually the lack of moving parts on these solar farms, I've never really had any issues. Predators, as with a home farm, are the biggest challenge, and making sure you've got good fencing, a good guardian animal, and keeping them moving tends to be the best way to keep them safe.
Okay. This is going to be our final question, and D. Hoffman gets it asked. What kind of, have you experimented with different seed mixes, and what's your go-to mix for your sheep?
So 2, on solar farms, we don't get to make a lot of decisions for what goes between the arrays, but in the past, I've used Southern Broadcaster from Southeast Agri-Seeds for broadcasting under panels and confining those 200 sheep to like 2 acres, and had really good luck with that. On the home acres, also from Southeast Agri-Seed, I like triticale, and they do, what's it called? Soil Builder Plus that has annual ryegrass, triticale, hairy vetch, and crimson clover. But the challenge I find is that annual rye persists kind of long into the summer, given weird weather patterns sometimes, that it can stall out anything you want to plant there in the summer and make it harder to get a summer annual established.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. This was really great, Brock. I mean, I've sort of toyed with the idea of solar farms, putting my sheep on solar farms for well over a decade or 2. And so, and I've always sort of said no, but now I don't know now. Now I really want to do it. So you've got me all excited. Okay, so we do have a few housekeeping items to share before we sign off today. A record of this recording and slides will be available tomorrow, hopefully. These documents will be archived on our website, and I will email that out in an email. And also I've saved a bunch of the links that Brock shared, and I even took a screenshot of that fantastic schedule thing. I thought that was great. We have some other good webinars coming up this spring, or I guess it's late winter, early spring, just a few more left. I think it's 4 left. There will be links to those to register for those in that follow-up email. A sincere thank you to Brock. It's been a pleasure. And finally, I would like to thank everyone out there in the audience for their interest, attention, and absolutely fantastic questions. We have a smart group of people who follow us and come to these webinars. So I hope everybody had a great experience today. And we'll see you guys again not next week, in 2 weeks for our next webinar. Bye, everybody. Fantastic job, Brock. Thank you.